Welcome to my channel, folks. I'm Nancy Thompson, your storyteller, bringing you American tall tales, unsolved mysteries, and a whole lot more. Today, I've got a wild story lined up for you, a real roller coaster about family, grit, and a touch of the supernatural. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's dive into today's tale. Our story kicks off with Susan Hill, a woman who's been married to her husband, Jake Morrison, for a solid decade. They live out in the rugged hills of Tennessee, but there's one big shadow over their life together: no kids. Not a single son or daughter to call their own. Susan's taken a lot of flack for it too. Her in-laws aren't shy about letting her know she's let the family down. But there's one person in Jake's family who's got her back: her mother-in-law, Martha Morrison. Martha's a kind soul with sharp eyes and a big heart. She sees how tough it is for Susan and stands up for her every chance she gets. Over the years, the two women forge a bond tighter than oak roots, a real mother-daughter love that warms the heart. But a few years back, tragedy struck. Martha passed away, leaving Susan devastated. She wept rivers at the old woman's bedside, fainting more than once from the grief. Jake, watching his wife crumble, blamed himself hard. "If only I'd given Mom a grandson to hold while she was still with us," he'd mutter. Susan, 2 years older than Jake, was pushing 30 now, and still, there wasn't a whisper of a baby on the way. Desperate to start a family, Jake started chasing down every old wives' tale and backwoods remedy he could find. For over 10 years, he tried everything: herbal teas, strange diets, you name it. But instead of a miracle, all he got was a body breaking down. Half the month, he's laid up sick, too weak to work. To keep food on the table, Susan took matters into her own hands. She'd sling an axe over her shoulder and trek up into the mountains to chop firewood. Just a few days ago, a big storm rolled through, tearing apart the rickety wooden bridge that led into the forest. The folks who relied on that bridge, lumberjacks and woodcutters like Susan, were stuck waiting for repairs. Down in the nearby town of Pine Hollow, where people still cooked with wood stoves, the firewood supply dried up fast. Demand shot through the roof, and prices tripled overnight. When Susan caught wind of this, she saw dollar signs. "This is our shot to make some real money," she told herself. See, she knew a secret path into the mountains, one her dad, a grizzled old herbalist named Tom Hill, had stumbled across years ago. He'd kept it hush-hush, passing it down only to her. Jake wasn't thrilled. "It's too risky, Sue," he pleaded. "Stay home." But Susan shook her head. "We've got barely a scoop of rice left in the pantry, Jake. If I don't go, we're both going hungry." So at the crack of dawn, she stoked the fire, cooked up what little they had, strapped a rope across her back, grabbed her axe, and headed out. Susan trudged through the muddy foothills, her boots sinking into the soggy earth left by the storm. The secret path her dad, Tom Hill, had shown her years back wasn't much to look at, just a narrow trail snaking up toward a rocky cliff. She remembered hiking it as a skinny teenager, tagging along while Tom hunted for wild herbs. Back then, it was their little secret, tucked away near the edge of Pine Hollow's dense forest. Hardly anyone else knew it existed, and Susan liked it that way. The trail led her to a sheer rock face, but she knew the trick: a slim crevice on one side, just wide enough for someone her size to squeeze through. She turned sideways, sucking in her breath, and edged into the gap. Inside, it was like stepping back in time. No one had been through here in years. Cobwebs draped across the passage like old curtains, sticking to her hair and clothes. Susan swatted them away, grumbling as the sticky threads clung to her. She wasn't one for tight spaces, and the dim light made her move slow and careful. It took her a good half-hour to shuffle through, her axe scraping against the stone walls. When she finally popped out the other side, the world opened up. Sunlight poured down, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. The forest here was untouched. Wild grass grew waist-high, and the trees towered overhead, their branches heavy with green. The storm hadn't done much damage up here. The thick canopy had shielded the limbs from snapping. Susan grinned. "Jackpot," she muttered, eyeing a big oak perfect for chopping. She might have been petite, but when she swung that axe, she was a force of nature. With a few powerful hacks, the tree groaned and crashed to the ground, sending birds scattering. She worked steady and hard, losing track of time as she felled trees and stacked the wood into a hefty bundle. When she was done, she wiped the sweat from her brow and hauled the pile toward a nearby creek. That crevice she'd come through? No way it'd fit the firewood. But Susan had a plan. She'd noticed years ago how this creek flowed down the mountain, winding its way right past their little cabin. Jake had even dug a ditch back in the day to channel the water into their backyard, made it easier for his mom to wash clothes when she got too old to hike. Smart man, Susan thought. She'd told Jake to wait by that ditch today, ready to fish out the wood when it floated down. They'd dry some for themselves and sell the rest for a tidy profit. With a heave, she tossed the bundle into the creek and watched it bob along, carried by the current. Then she knelt by the water, splashing her face to rinse off the grime. The sky was darkening, clouds rolling in, promising more rain. Better hustle, she told herself. Lingering alone in these mountains during a storm wasn't safe. She turned back toward the crevice, retracing her steps through the spider-infested passage. Halfway through, a faint sound stopped her cold, a muffled cry for help, echoing from somewhere in the brush ahead. Susan froze, her heart thumping. Who else could be up here, she wondered. Maybe another woodcutter had found her secret path and gotten into trouble. She strained her ears, pinpointing the sound. It was weak but desperate. Kindness had always been her compass, so she didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the noise, pushing through the tangled undergrowth. When she broke through the bushes, her jaw dropped. There, pinned under a boulder half her height, was a young woman in her 20s. She was dressed fancy, like some city girl gone hiking in her Sunday best. Sweat poured down her pale face, and her eyes flickered with panic. When she spotted Susan, she rasped out, "Please, ma'am, help me." Susan stepped closer and gasped. The woman's belly was swollen, pregnant, no doubt about it. "Hang on," Susan said, her voice steady. "I'll get you out. You're gonna be okay." Susan crouched beside the trapped woman, her mind racing. The boulder pinning her was massive, too heavy to lift straight up, even for someone as scrappy as Susan. She scanned the scene, hands on her hips. "Don't worry," she told the woman. "I've got this." The stranger nodded weakly, her breath shallow. Up close, Susan could see the dirt-streaked silk dress and the way her hands clutched her swollen belly. Whoever she was, she didn't belong out here in the wild. First, Susan tried wrapping her arms around the rock, grunting as she strained to budge it. Nothing. It barely twitched. "Come on, you stubborn hunk of stone," she muttered. Then an idea hit her. She grabbed her axe and started digging a shallow trench beside the boulder. If she could tip it into the hole, maybe the woman could wriggle free. As she worked, she kept talking to keep the stranger alert. "What's your name, hon? How'd you end up under this thing?" The woman's voice was faint but steady. "I'm Sarah. Sarah Reed. I came up here foraging a few days back, looking for herbs. Then that storm hit, and I took cover. Next thing I know, this rock comes tumbling down the slope and traps me." She winced, her face paling. "I've been stuck ever since." Susan nodded, her hands blistering as she hacked at the dirt. "Well, Sarah, you're lucky I came along. Hang in there." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I've got no one left back home, husband's gone, family too. Just me, and this little one." She patted her belly. "I was out here trying to scrape by for the baby. Guess I pushed my luck too far." Susan's heart twinged. She knew that kind of grit, doing whatever it took for the people you loved. "Mothers don't quit," she said softly. "You're tougher than you think." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but Susan kept at it, dirt flying. Sarah's voice grew quieter, her eyelids fluttering. "Stay with me, Sarah." Susan urged, digging faster. Finally, the boulder shifted, loosening just enough. "All right, listen up," she said. "When I count to 3, you crawl out. Ready?" Sarah gave a feeble nod. 1, 2, 3. With a mighty shove, Susan tipped the rock into the trench, and Sarah dragged herself free, collapsing a few feet away. Susan rushed to her side, checking her over. Blood soaked Sarah's dress below the waist. Her legs were a mess from the pressure. She groaned, clutching her stomach. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. I won't make it much longer. But I need one more favor." Her eyes locked onto Susan's, pleading. "Anything," Susan replied, her throat tight. Sarah grabbed Susan's hand and pressed it to her belly. "I know you've always wanted a child," she said, her voice trembling with some strange certainty. "You're about to have a son." Before Susan could process the words, a jolt shot through her, like a spark from a frayed wire. Her vision blurred, and she crumpled to the ground, out cold, her hand still resting on Sarah's stomach. When Susan came to, the air crackled with ozone. A storm was brewing overhead. She blinked, disoriented, and sat up.
Sarah var skåne.
No trace of her, just the overturned boulder and a faint scorch mark on the ground nearby.
Tanda rumblet, and Susanne shivered.
Had she imagined it? No, the ache in her hands from digging was real. Confused and spooked, she staggered to her feet. The sun was dipping low, she had to get home. As she stumbled back through the crevice and down the mountain, two figures watched from the clouds above.
Von hält an umbrella, the otter strummet a guitar. An odd pair, like so meeting out of a fever dream.
She's a good one, the umbrella man said, his voice deep and slow. A mother's heart in her, even without a kid of her own. The guitar player nodded. That Sarah Reed was no ordinary gal. She was a mountain spirit, some call him snake folk, been hiding out here for 100 years. Took a hit during a big storm a while back, got herself pregnant, and was fighting to keep that baby alive. When Susan saved her, she passed the child on, traded her life for it. Lightning flashed, and Susan, oblivious below, kept walking. Back home, Jake was waiting by the ditch, hauling out the firewood she'd sent downstream. When she stumbled into the yard, muddy and dazed, he frowned.
Jure late, Sue.
What happened up there? She told him about Sarah, the rescue, the collapse, the vanishing. I don't get it, she admitted. She was hurt bad, but then, nothing. Like she up and disappeared. Jake scratched his head. That's downright rude if you ask me. You save her life, and she bolts without a thank you? If I ever meet her, I'll give her a piece of my mind.
Susanne schuk her het, tot ihre Tuagur.
Maybe she had her reasons, Jake. Let's not judge her too quick. They ate a quiet dinner and turned in early. That night, Susan dreamed of Sarah holding a baby boy, handing him to her with a smile. He's yours now, Sarah said. When Susan woke, a strange nausea twisted her gut, something she'd never felt before.
The morning after her strange dream, Susanne woke up feeling off.
Her stomach churned, and even the smell of Jake frying bacon made her gag.
She warfet of breakfast, muttering, must we eaten so meeting but yesterday.
Jake frowned but didn't push. Across the road their neighbor, Mrs. Clara Watkins, an old-timer with a knack for spotting trouble, caught sight of Susan's pale face as she hauled water from the well.
You allrecht, honey. Clara kellet out, hobbling over. You look like this warmed over.
Susan shrugged, clutching her belly. Just a sour stomach, Clara.
Il shekelt off.
But Clara's eyes narrowed, and a grin spread across her weathered face. Sour stomach, huh? I've seen that look before, girl. Back when I was carrying my boy, I couldn't keep a bite down either.
Jure in the family way, mark my words. Susanne frotze, half lauking, half daubting. No chance, Clara.
We've been trying for years. Nothing's ever stuck. Clara just chuckled.
Well, miracles happen. You'll see.
She hollered across the hollow to Jake, who was stacking the firewood Susan had sent down the creek.
Jake Morrison, get your tile over to Doc Simmons.
Your wife's got a bun in the oven. Jake dropped an armful of logs, his jaw slack. He bolted down the dirt road to fetch the town doctor, a gray-bearded man named Elias Simmons who'd been patching up Pine Hollow folks for decades. Doc Simmons showed up with his black bag, a twinkle in his eye. Susan sat on their sagging porch swing while he pressed his fingers to her wrist, feeling her pulse. After a quiet minute, he broke into a grin. Well, I'll be. Congratulations, you two, Clara's right. You're expecting. Susan's eyes welled up, and she choked out, finally. I can tell Martha up there we did it. Jake hooped, clapping Doc on the back, then tried to slip him a few crumpled bills as thanks. Doc waved it off. Keep it, son. I'm kin, your pa and me were cousins. Just take care of her. But then Doc's face turned serious. He pulled Jake aside, lowering his voice. Listen, her pulse is strong, but it's odd.
Wie genau we can pin down.
Could be a tough road ahead. Be ready. Jake's grin faded. He'd been frail himself for years, half the time too sick to stand, and the thought of losing this miracle hit him like a gut punch. He nodded, hiding the worry as he shuffled back to Susan. She was already chattering with Clara about baby names, her face glowing. Jake couldn't bear to dim that light. Let her have this, he thought. We'll deal with whatever comes. 10 months later, the big day crept closer. Susan was a bundle of nerves, wondering if it'd be a boy or a girl. Jake, meanwhile, fretted over Doc's warning, rehearsing how he'd comfort her if things went south.
Von stormy night, Herr Peinzit hart.
Jake stoked the fire and boiled water while Clara bustled in to help. Susan's cries echoed through the cabin, and Jake paced outside the door, chewing his nails to stubs. Hours dragged on until Clara burst out, her face ashen.
Jake, get in here, now.
He rushed inside and stopped dead. Susan lay unconscious on the bed, her breath shallow. Beside her, coiled in the sheets, was a tiny white snake, no bigger than a garden hose, its eyes still shut.
Jakes het spoon. Wat in Gods Name?
Clara stammered, she birthed that. I swear, Jake, it came right out of her.
Wird spriet like wildfire trug Pine Hollow.
By noon, folks were whispering about the Morrison curse. That snake's bad luck, they said. Gotta burn it before it brings ruin. Susan, groggy but awake by then, clutched the little creature to her chest. No one's touching him, she snapped. I carried him 10 months, he's mine. Jake, still reeling, saw the steel in her eyes and caved.
Allrecht, Sue.
We'll keep him. The town didn't take kindly to that. Neighbors who'd once swapped pies and gossip with the Morrisons started crossing the road to avoid them. They called the snake the devil's spawn, and swore it'd hex the whole hollow. But Susan named him Little White and set him up in the backyard, where he'd doze in the sun by day and slither around at night like a guard dog. He couldn't talk, but darn if he didn't seem to understand her. Fetch me that stick, White, she'd say, and he'd glide right over with it. Jake, though, never warmed up. Every glimpse of those pale scales sent a shiver down his spine.
10 years flee by in Pine Hollow, and little white wasn't so little anymore.
That tiny snake Susan had cradled was now thicker than a man's arm, with gleaming white scales that caught the sunlight like polished ivory. By day, he'd coil up in the backyard under the old sycamore tree, soaking in the warmth. At night, he'd patrol the property, hissing at raccoons or stray dogs that got too close. Susan swore he was smarter than most folks in town. He couldn't speak, but if she said, "White, check the hen house," he'd slither off and come back once the chickens were safe. Feeding him was another story. What started with scraps of meat turned into whole rabbits and chickens as he grew. Susan took to hunting in the woods to keep him fed, and Jake grumbled about the cost when she couldn't bag enough. The townsfolk, already sour on the Morrisons, got jumpier every year. "That snake's gonna turn on us," they'd mutter at the general store.
Mark my words, it'll itzomiones kit.
3 times they showed up at the cabin, pitchforks in hand, begging Susan to set Little White loose in the mountains. "He's family," she'd shoot back, arms crossed.
You don't kick family out.
Jake, though, wasn't so sure. He'd never shaken that chill Little White gave him, like staring at something that didn't belong in this world. One evening, as the fire crackled in their cabin, he broached the subject. "Sue, he's grown now. Big enough to fend for himself.
Wat happens wen wir regone?
Who's gonna look after him then?" Susan's eyes flashed, but Jake pressed on. "He's a wild thing at heart. Let him learn to hunt, survive on his own. If we die old and gray, he'll need that." Susan stared into the flames, her jaw tight. She hated the idea. Little White was her boy, scales or not. But Jake's words gnawed at her. Parents couldn't hover forever. Kids had to spread their wings, or slither off in this case. "Fine," she said at last, her voice thick. "But we do it right." So they picked a clear spring day, the kind where the sky stretched blue and endless. They packed a sack of jerky for themselves, not White, and led him up the mountain trail, the secret path Susan knew like the back of her hand. At a clearing near the creek, Susan knelt beside Little White. "You're a big fella now," she said, tears brimming. "Time to take care of yourself out here. Don't you forget us, okay?" Jake stood back, shifting uncomfortably. Then, out of nowhere, Little White's jaws parted, and a raspy voice croaked, "Ma, thanks for raising me these 10 years. If you ever need me, stack 3 rocks under that sycamore back home. I'll come runnin'. Susan and Jake gaped, rooted to the spot. Little White gave a slow nod, then turned and glided into the forest, his white tail vanishing among the pines. The walk home was quiet. Too stunned to speak, they kept stealing glances at each other. Did he just talk? Jake finally mumbled. Susan nodded, dazed. He did. And we ain't telling a soul. They swore to keep it secret. Pine Hollow would lose its mind over a talking snake. A few more years rolled by, and Jake's health took a nosedive. The sickness that had plagued him for decades worsened. Coughing fits left him bedridden, his frame wasting away. He started fretting about Susan. If I go, who's gonna look out for you? He rasped one night. She squeezed his hand. I'll manage, Jake. But he wouldn't let it rest. We've got no kin left. How about we adopt? Find a good kid to take in, someone honest to carry on after me. Susan's heart sank. She'd always felt guilty for not giving Jake a human child. Little White didn't count in his eyes. All right, she agreed. Let's do it. Over the years, they'd scraped together a decent nest egg. Susan's firewood hustle, paired with odd jobs Jake managed when he could, had paid off. Word of their savings spread, and soon relatives they barely knew started sniffing around, pitching their own kids as candidates. One stood out, Ethan, a lanky 15-year-old with a mop of brown hair and a quiet way about him. He was Jake's cousin's boy, orphaned when his folks died a few years back, raised since by an aunt. Ethan had a good look, honest eyes, strong hands, and Susan liked that he didn't come with parents to haggle over him. No messy family ties, she told Jake. He's perfect. So they picked a sunny Sunday, held a small ceremony at the cabin with a preacher, and made it official, Ethan Morrison, their adopted son. Ethan settled into the Morrison cabin like he'd always belonged. At first, he was a dream, polite, hard-working, pitching in with chores without a fuss. Susan doted on him, maybe overcompensating for Little White being gone. Whatever he wanted, new boots, a fishing pole, she'd scrape together the cash to get it. He's our boy now, she'd tell Jake with a smile. Ethan took it in stride, humble and grateful. But as months turned to years, something shifted. The kid who'd once said thank you for a patched-up jacket started expecting more, nicer clothes, a horse to ride into town. By 17, Ethan was a different person. The Morrisons' nest egg, built from years of Susan's firewood runs and Jake's odd jobs, caught his eye. He'd grown up poor, and now that money was in reach, he figured it was his due. I'm their son, ain't I? They ought to be glad I'm here, he'd mutter to himself. Soon he was blowing cash at the saloon in Pine Hollow, decked out in flashy vests and riding a sleek mare he'd talked Jake into buying. Worse, he started sneaking off to the seedier side of town, gambling and carousing till dawn. Susan watched the savings dwindle, her patience fraying. One night, after Ethan stumbled home reeking of whiskey, she'd had enough. You're squandering everything we worked for, she snapped, hands on her hips. We took you in to build a future, not burn it down. Ethan, 3 sheets to the wind, sneered back. You ain't my real ma. Quit actin' like you own me. His words hit like a slap. Susan's face went red, then white, and she swayed, clutching the table. Before Jake could catch her, she crumpled to the floor, out cold. Ethan sobered up fast, panic kicking in. Pa, I didn't mean it, he stammered, but Jake waved him off, kneeling by Susan. Her breathing was shallow, her teeth clenched tight. Jake hollered for Doc Simmons, who rode over in the dead of night. The old man took one look, her rolled-back eyes, her rigid jaw, and shook his head. She's had a fit, Jake. Too far gone. Start making arrangements. Ethan dropped to his knees, sobbing apologies, but Jake barely heard him. His mind raced back to Little White's promise. 3 rocks under the sycamore. Ethan, Jake rasped, you remember that snake story? How he said he'd come if we needed him. Ethan blinked, confused. He'd heard the rumors about Susan birthing a snake, but never the details. Yeah, vaguely, he mumbled. Jake grabbed his shoulder. He spoke to us, said if we stacked 3 rocks under that tree out back, he'd show. Go do it. Now. Ethan didn't argue. If Susan died because of him, the town would never forgive him. He'd be an outcast or worse. He bolted outside, grabbed 3 stones from the yard, and piled them under the sycamore, heart pounding. He'd barely stepped back into the cabin when a gust of wind rattled the windows. Ethan turned, and there it was, Little White, coiled in the yard, bigger than ever, his scales glinting like moonlight. He was massive now, thick as a barrel, with a voice like gravel. "Pa," he rumbled, "I felt Ma's in trouble. Lay her out here, I'll fix her." Jake didn't hesitate. He and Ethan hauled Susan's bed into the yard, her limp form still as stone. Little White reared up, his head swaying. Then with a low hiss, he spat a golden spark, like a firefly on a summer night, right onto Susan's chest. It sank into her, and she stirred, eyes fluttering open. She blinked at the giant snake looming over her, then broke into a teary smile. "White, my boy. You came back." Little White's eyes softened and he rasped, "Ma, I've been up in the mountains learnin' things. Folks up there told me 'bout Sarah Reed, my real ma. She was a spirit, gave me to you to keep me alive. You raised me 10 years, and I ain't never forgettin' that. You and Pa are my family, always will be." Susan sat up, shaky but alive, and reached for him. Ethan, still trembling from his guilt, dropped to his knees again. "I'm sorry, Ma, I messed up bad. I'll change, I swear it." Blood trickled from his forehead where he'd banged it on the ground, begging. Susan's heart melted. She pulled him up, brushing dirt off his face. "You know you're wrong, and that's enough. We're family, Ethan, no more fighting." Little White couldn't stay long. Whatever mountain magic he'd tapped into pulled him back. With a final nod, he slithered off into the night. Susan watched him go, a mix of pride and sorrow swirling in her chest. She'd carried him, sure, but now she knew, he was Sarah's gift, a piece of that spirit sacrifice. Ethan, meanwhile, lay awake that night. The image of Little White's golden spark burned into his mind. He dodged a reckoning, but it left him rattled to the core. Ethan tried to turn over a new leaf after Susan's brush with death. He stuck close to home, chopping wood and fixing fences, keeping his head down. But the quiet didn't last. One afternoon, as he wandered into Pine Hollow for supplies, a commotion drew him in, drums banging, folks crowding the town square. A slick-haired man in a suit, flanked by 2 deputies, was nailing up a poster. Ethan, never much for reading, nudged a bystander. "What's it say?" The man smirked. "Governor's daughter up in Nashville's got some rare sickness. Docs say only a cure made from 3 front teeth of a white-horned snake can save her. Whoever brings him gets her hand in marriage, makes you the governor's son-in-law, rich as sin." Ethan's ears perked up. "Ain't that tough? Just snag a snake and yank its teeth, right?" The guy laughed. "Not any snake, kid. A horned white one, some kind of mountain legend. Good luck finding that." Ethan's mind raced. Little White had a small horn on his forehead. He'd seen it glinting the night Susan was saved. That's him, he thought, heart-thumping. The governor's daughter was said to be a beauty, and the wealth? He could see it, fancy suits, a big house, the whole town eating their hats for ever doubting him. He bolted home, bursting through the cabin door. "Ma, Pa. The governor needs Little White's teeth to save his girl. If we get him, I could marry her, take you both to Nashville to live like kings." Susan's face darkened.
"You wanna pulvites tät?"
How's he supposed to eat? He'd starve, Ethan. Jake, weaker than ever, stayed quiet, but Ethan pressed. "Come on, Ma, you care more about that snake than me?"
"I'm your son."
He stomped toward the door, feigning a tantrum.
"Gessel just autere, save you the trouble."
He lunged for a porch post like he'd ram it, but Jake grabbed him, frail arms shaking.
"Hold up, son.
Let's think this through." Jake pulled Susan aside, voice low. "Sue, he's right about one thing. We're old, and he's our future. White's tough. Losing 3 teeth won't kill him."
"Let isen ter Ypsilon. Susans Eis wellet ab."
"It'll hurt him, Jake. I carried him 10 months. He's my boy, same as Ethan. If anyone messes with my kids, I'll fight him tooth and nail." She glared, fierce as a cornered bear, and Ethan backed off, sulking. That night, while Susan slept, Ethan cornered Jake by the fireplace.
"Pa, jure Wastinger weh. This is our shot at so meeting big. Don't let her Stubbornes ruinitel handlema. You just stay out of it."
Jake hesitated, then sighed.
"Allrecht, son.
Go get the teeth."
I'll cover for you. Ethan grinned, slipping out into the dark. Under the sycamore, he stuck at 3 rocks, whispering, "Come on, White."
Little White appeared, his bulk rustling the leaves. "Ethan?"
"Trouble at home." Ethan spoon atale quickes lichtning.
Ma and Pa scraped by their whole lives, never had nothing nice.
"If you get your teeth, I can marry the governor's girl. Give a Akashi life in Nashville."
Folks who laughed at us? They'll choke on it. Just 3 teeth, brother, that's all I need. Little White paused, his horn glinting. 3 out of 4 front teeth wouldn't kill him, just make eating trickier. For Ma and Pa.
"Allricht, take herumbläht, lowering his head."
Ethan grabbed a pair of pliers from the shed and went to work, yanking hard. Little White flinched, eyes watering, but didn't pull away. 3 teeth clinked into Ethan's palm, blood-streaked and sharp. He didn't head home. Instead, he hightailed it to the county seat, banging on the sheriff's door at dawn. "I got the teeth," he crowed. The sheriff called in a doctor, who inspected them, nodding. "They're the real deal, horned white snake, sure enough." But then the doc frowned.
"White, ohne skrägt."
"Won't do. You'll need another." Ethan's stomach dropped. He'd pulled too hard on the first one, snapping it. Cursing under his breath, he trudged back to the sycamore, stacking the rocks again.
Little White slithered out, slower this time.
"What now?" he hissed. "One's busted," Ethan admitted.
"Need one more." Little White sighed. "Fine, take it."
Ethan leaned in, pliers ready, but a dark thought flickered. "If I'm the governor's son-in-law, I don't need ma nagging me forever."
"Gut teeth, start fresh."
Little White's eyes flashed red, like he'd heard the thought. His jaws twitched, then snapped shut. Ethan screamed, a split-second cry cut off as the snake swallowed him whole. Little White shuddered, then slithered toward the cabin. By the time he reached the yard, his form shifted, scales melting into skin, horn fading. He stepped inside as Ethan, voice eerily calm. "I'm back, Ma."
Susan and Jake, bleary-eyed, smiled from the kitchen.
"Good to see you, son," Jake said. A month later, the governor's men arrived with news. The teeth had cured the girl. Ethan, Little White in disguise, married her, and the family moved to a Nashville mansion, none the wiser. The move to Nashville was like stepping into a dream. Ethan, Little White in disguise, handed over the snake teeth, and the governor's daughter, Abigail, made a full recovery. True to the proclamation, she married Ethan in a lavish ceremony, complete with brass bands and a crowd of gawking Tennesseans. Governor Hargrove, a barrel-chested man with a politician's grin, clapped Ethan on the back.
"You're a family now, son. Welcome to the good life."
He gifted the Morrisons a sprawling estate on the city's edge, white columns, manicured lawns, the works. Susan and Jake, wide-eyed, traded their rickety cabin for polished hardwood floors and crystal chandeliers. Ethan played his role to perfection, charming Abigail and the Nashville elite. He showered Susan and Jake with the governor's rewards: new clothes, a carriage, even a hired cook so Susan wouldn't lift a finger. Susan, though, kept her old axe by the fireplace, a reminder of where she'd come from. Jake's health held steady for a while, the clean air and soft beds doing wonders, but he never shook the cough that had haunted him. Susan spent her days tending a small garden out back, humming to herself, content to watch Ethan thrive. 10 years passed in a blur.
Abigail bore Ethan a son, and the family gretigt knit.
But time took its toll. One crisp fall day, Susan fell ill, feverish, weak, her strength sapped overnight. She called Ethan to her bedside, leaving Abigail and the boy in the parlor. Her eyes, still sharp despite the gray in her hair, locked onto his. "Little White," she whispered, a faint smile tugging her lips.
"I know it's you.
Been watching you all these years." Ethan, or rather Little White, froze, his human mask slipping for a heartbeat.
"Ma, how'd you know?"
Susan chuckled, weak but warm.
"A motorknos her on."
"You ate Ethan up, didn't you? Took his place. But you've been good to us, and that's what counts."
"I'm heading out now. Can't protect you anymore. Take care of yourself, son."
Her hand squeezed his, then went slack. She was gone, peaceful as a sunset.
Little White's eyes welled up, human tears on a borrowed face. "Goodbye, Ma, hem om uret.
She'd seen through him, loved him anyway, a debt he'd never repay. The funeral was quiet, just family and a few Nashville friends. Abigail mourned her mother-in-law, never suspecting the truth. Little White buried Susan beside Jake, who'd passed a year earlier, in a plot overlooking the Cumberland River. He kept up the charade, raising his son, loving Abigail, living the life Ethan had craved. But Susan's words stayed with him, a quiet echo of the mountain spirit who'd birthed him and the woman who'd raised him. Now, let's step back and chew on this tale. Susan Hill was a good soul, saved Sarah Reed up on that mountain, no strings attached. She never met Sarah before or after, but her kindness set everything in motion. Folks say good deeds come back around, and Susan's life proves it. Sure, she hit rough patches, Jake's sickness, the town turning on her, Ethan's greed, but in the end she died happy, surrounded by plenty. That's the payoff for a generous heart. Ethan, though? He started out decent, a kid with potential. But he let the promise of riches twist him, took Susan's love for granted, thought he deserved it all. His greed drove him to betray Little White, and it cost him everything. Swallowed up, gone in a flash, all because he couldn't see the blessings he already had. Little White, bless him, stepped in, honored his ma's spirit, and turned a bad seed into something good. So what's the takeaway? Kindness is the bedrock of a life well lived. Do good, and it'll ripple back to you, even if the road's bumpy. Greed? That's a trap, chases you down a path to nothing. Susan's story shows it plain. Help others, stay humble, and you'll find your peace.
Etans ent? A varning. Grab to hart, and you'll lose it all.
That's how it goes in these hills, and everywhere else too. That's the yarn for today, folks.
What do you think?
If it struck a chord, drop a note below. Love hearing from you. Stick around for the next one, a tale about a down-on-his-luck schoolteacher who gets a ghostly nudge toward fortune. See you then. Welcome back, folks.
Nancy Thompson here with another tale from the American heartland.
This one's about a fella down on his luck, a twist of fate, and a little help from beyond the grave.
So pour yourself a glass of sweet tea, pull up a chair, and let's get to it. Meet Henry Hank Wheeler, a schoolteacher from Willow Creek, Kentucky.
Hank was a bright spark. Back when he was 12, he won every spelling bee and math contest in the county. Folks said he'd go far, maybe even teach at some fancy college up north. But life had other plans. His parents passed early, his ma from fever, his pa from a busted leg that went bad, and left him with nothing but a crumbling farmhouse and a stack of debts. No money for books or schooling, Hank had to fend for himself, taking whatever work he could scrape up. Now, at 25, he was a teacher without a classroom. He'd hoped to land a gig at one of the little schoolhouses dotting the hills, teaching kids their ABCs for a modest wage, but Willow Creek wasn't hiring. His honest streak didn't help. Too proud to beg favors from old friends, he watched winter creeping closer with no job in sight. The pantry was down to a sack of stale cornmeal, and New Year's looked bleak. Hank's brown hair was already streaked with gray from worry, and he spent most days sprawled on his lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling. One frosty morning, roosters crowing in the distance, his wife, Ellie, gave him a nudge. Ellie was a patient soul, never one to nag like some might in hard times. "Hank, get up," she said, stirring a pot of thin gruel over the fire. "You've got a head full of smarts, don't let it go to waste lying there." Hank groaned, rolling over. "Smarts don't buy bread, Ellie. What's the point of hauling myself out early when there's nothing to show for it?" Ellie didn't flinch. "Mrs. Carter down the road still owes me $2 for that quilt I stitched. Go ask her for it, we'll get some flour, tide us over." Hank sighed but dragged himself up, tugging on his threadbare coat. He trudged to the Carter's place, collected the crumpled bills, and stopped by the general store for a few pounds of flour. Ellie was kneading dough when he got back, but their luck didn't hold. The old shed they used as a kitchen, half-rotted from years of rain, picked that moment to give up. A beam crashed down, smashing the pot of gruel and shattering their only cookpot. Hank threw his hands up, glaring at the sky. "I'm a learned man, 12 years old and top of my class, and now I'm fodder for some cosmic joke. What did I do to deserve this?" Ellie tried to soothe him, patting his arm, when a sharp rap echoed from the door. Hank opened it, and there stood Charlie Dawson, his cousin, all 6 feet of him, leading a sturdy bay horse. Charlie looked rushed, his hat cocked sideways. "Hank, been meanin' to check on you." Got a job lined up teachin' anywhere yet? Hank's face burned. Nope, nothin' yet, he mumbled. Charlie slapped his thigh, grinning. Well shoot, I've got just the thing. There's a school out near Lexington, pays $500 a year. You in? Hank's jaw dropped. Heck yeah, I'm in. Charlie tossed him a small leather pouch. Here's the deal, $5 up front from the folks hirin'. They'll send someone come spring to fetch you. Gotta run, take care cousin. Before Hank could blink, Charlie swung onto his horse and galloped off, dust trailing behind him. Hank stood there, clutching the pouch like it might vanish. Ellie peeked over his shoulder, eyes wide. What's got you grinning like a fox in a henhouse? He spilled the story, Charlie's visit, the job, the cash. Ellie frowned, puzzled. That's mighty strange, Hank. Charlie's been dead 3 years, kicked by a mule, remember? Hank's stomach flipped. He'd been so caught up, he'd forgotten. Dead or not, this money's real, he said, opening the pouch. Inside gleamed $5 cold and solid. He's my kin, he wouldn't steer me wrong, ghost or no ghost. Ellie shook her head but didn't argue. Something about those coins felt heavier than they should. Winter dragged on in Willow Creek, and Hank clung to Charlie's promise like a lifeline. Those $5 sat heavy in his pocket, a glimmer of hope amid the cold. Ellie wasn't sold, kept muttering about ghosts and tricks, but Hank brushed it off. Dead or not, Charlie's never let me down, he'd say, flipping a coin in the air. Friends who heard the tale warned him off. Spirits don't hand out jobs, Hank. You're a skin for trouble. But he held firm, stubborn as a mule, waiting for spring. The months crawled by, and no one showed. Doubts nibbled at him, maybe Ellie was right, and he'd been a fool. But one afternoon in early March, as he pored over an old book by the fire, a knock rattled the door. Hank opened it to find a young man in a crisp blue jacket, polite as a preacher. You Henry Wheeler? He asked, tipping his hat. Name's Tom Grayson. My boss, Mr. Jeremiah Tate, sent me to fetch you. He's lookin' for a teacher. You ready to go? Hank's heart leapt. Darn right I am. He grabbed his coat and a battered satchel, his worldly goods didn't amount to much, and turned to Ellie. Told you Charlie wasn't pullin' my leg. I'll send word once I'm settled. She hugged him tight, worry creasing her brow, but waved him off as he climbed into Tom's wagon. The horse clopped along, and Hank settled in, the Kentucky hills rolling by. Exhaustion hit him hard, he'd barely slept lately, and soon he was out, the wagon sway lulling him under. When he woke, night had fallen. He peeked out the canvas flap, stars glittered above, one shining brighter than the rest, like a lantern in the sky. Slept a whole day, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. The wagon rattled to a stop outside a grand old house, 2 stories, clapboard siding, with a wide porch lit by oil lamps. Tom hopped down and grinned. We're here. Come meet the boss. An old man waited at the door, his white hair glowing under the lamplight, dressed in a long coat that had seen better days. Hank stepped forward, extending a hand. Henry Wheeler, sir. Pleasure to meet you. The man's grip was firm, his voice gravelly. Jeremiah Tate's the name. 97 years young, if I do say so. Welcome to my place, son. He ushered Hank inside, Tom trailing with the satchel. The parlor was warm, all polished wood and plush chairs. Hank sank into one, still dazed, and cleared his throat. So, what's the job, Mr. Tate? Jeremiah settled across from him, eyes twinkling. Call me Jerry. I've got 2 grandsons, Sam's 14, Luke's 9. Need a sharp fella like you to teach 'em readin', writin', and 'rithmetic. That sound up your alley? Hank nodded eagerly. Born for it, sir, Jerry. Before he could say more, a door swung open, and 2 boys shuffled in, Sam lanky with a mop of brown hair, and Luke small and freckled. They mumbled hellos, sizing Hank up. Then the real welcome kicked off. A pair of young women, pretty as spring flowers with aprons tied tight, bustled in, setting the table with a spread Hank could hardly believe: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and a jug of cider that smelled like heaven. Figured you'd be hungry after the trip, Jerry said with a wink. Dig in. Hank didn't need telling twice. He and Jerry ate till their faces flushed, swapping small talk between bites. The food was rich, the company easy, better than anything Hank had known in years. When they finished, the table cleared like magic, those girls whisking plates away without a sound. Jerry clapped a hand on Hank's shoulder. Time to rest up. Luke, show Mr. Wheeler to his room. Luke led him down a hall to a cozy guest room, fresh sheets, a quilt thick as a cloud, and a desk with an inkpot waiting. Hank flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. This place is something else, he muttered. The Tates had money, no doubt, more than Willow Creek folks could dream of. Where'd it come from? He didn't know Jerry's story, but after months of scraping by, he wasn't complaining. Sleep took him fast, and for the first time in ages, he dreamed of something good, books, laughter, and a future that didn't feel so far off. Hank woke to sunlight streaming through the guest room window, the smell of bacon drifting up from the kitchen. He splashed water on his face, still half convinced he dreamed the whole thing, the wagon, the big house, Jerry Tate's welcome. But as he stepped into the hall, there was Luke, tugging his sleeve. Come on, Mr. Wheeler, breakfast's ready. Hank grinned and followed, settling into a routine that felt too good to be true. Teaching Sam and Luke turned out to be a breeze. The boys were sharp, Sam had a knack for numbers, while Luke could recite poetry after one read-through. Hank started simple, multiplication tables, a bit of Longfellow, some Kentucky history. By noon, they were swapping ideas like old pals. You're a natural, Mr. Wheeler, Sam said, scribbling equations. Hank just chuckled. Call me Hank, fellas. And you too make it easy. The days rolled smooth, lessons in the morning, lunch with Jerry, then afternoons free to roam the Tate estate, a sprawling spread of fields and orchards. A month in, spring hit full bloom, and Hank was knee-deep in teaching the boys about the Battle of Blue Licks when a knock interrupted. Mr. Wheeler, someone's here for you, one of the Tate girls called. Mary, he reckoned, with her red curls. Hank stepped outside, and there stood Charlie Dawson, leaning on a fence post like he'd never left. This time he wasn't rushed. His coat was neat, his grin wide. Howdy, cousin. Settlin' in all right. Hank blinked, then laughed. Charlie, you're a sight for sore eyes. Yeah, this place is a godsend, thanks to you. They sat on the porch steps, the air thick with apple blossoms. Charlie stretched out, casual as ever. Told you I'd come through. I'm workin' for some big shots now, down at the Reaper's office, you might say. Keeps me hoppin'. Hank raised an eyebrow. Reaper's office? What's that mean? Charlie winked. Let's just say I handle the books for folks passin' through. Know a lot about who's comin' and goin'. Hank's curiosity spiked. So you've got the scoop on lifespans, huh?
How's my family lookin'? Charlie's grin faded a touch.
He counted on his fingers, muttering, then fixed Hank with a steady gaze. Most of 'em are fine, long roads ahead. But Ellie, she's hit a rough patch.
Sick, and quick.
You'd best head home and check on her.
I'll square it with Jerry, don't you worry.
Before Hank could protest, Charlie strode off toward the house, disappearing around the corner. Minutes later, Tom Grayson rolled up in the wagon, tipping his hat. Boss says you're needed home, Mr. Wheeler. Hop in.
Hank's gut twisted. Charlie's words rang true to ignore.
He climbed aboard, the ride back to Willow Creek a blur of dust and worry. When he stumbled into the farmhouse, Ellie was bustling around like always, sweeping the porch.
Hank.
You're back early, she said, smiling. He frowned, relieved but skeptical. Charlie said you were sick.
You feelin' okay?
She waved him off. Fit as a fiddle. That ghost cousin of yours must've got his wires crossed. Hank wanted to believe her. He figured he'd stay a few days, make sure, then head back to the Tates. But that night, Ellie's luck ran out.
She spiket a fever out of nowhere, boning up and babbling nonsense by midnight.
Hank tore through town, banging on Doc Harper's door, a wiry old sawbones who delivered half of Willow Creek. Doc took one look, dosed her with laudanum, and shook his head.
Fever spot, Hank.
I'll do what I can, but it ain't promisin'. 2 days of tonics and prayers didn't turn it around. By the 5th night, Ellie slipped away, quiet as a whisper. Hank buried her under the big oak out back, numb from grief. He'd barely processed it when Tom showed up again, wagon creaking. Mr. Tate says come on back whenever you're ready.
Sorry, but you're lost.
Hank nodded, hollowed out. With no one left in Willow Creek, he left the farmhouse to a neighbor and climbed aboard, the ride back to Lexington silent. Teaching resumed, but the joy was muted now. At 30 he was a widower, too young for it, and it gnawed at him. Nights got heavy, his thoughts circling Ellie's grave. He started talking to Charlie in his head, half praying, half cussing. You knew, didn't you? Why'd you let her go? One midnight, 3 days into his brooding, he lit a candle and muttered a plea. Charlie, come talk to me.
I'm drowning here.
Sure enough, the air shivered, and there was Charlie, perched on the bedpost like a hawk.
Hurt you Kellen, cousin.
I'm here. Hank sat up in bed, the candle flickering as Charlie Dawson lounged on the bedpost, looking more solid than any ghost ought to. You're a wreck, cousin, Charlie said, crossing his arms.
I feel your hertache also way down at the Reaper's office. Spill it, what's it in you?
Hank rubbed his face, the weight of Ellie's death pressing hard.
I'm alone, Charlie. Lost my wife, my home's empty, and I'm stuck here rattlin' around.
What's a man supposed to do? Charlie grinned, a spark lighting his eyes.
You're still kickin', ain't you? Plenty of life left to life.
Got any plans, or you just gonna mope till you're gray? Hank snorted, bitter. Plans? I'm broke as a church mouse, Charlie. What I got to offer anybody?
Charlie leaned in, unfazet.
Oh come on now, I'm your kin, and I've got ideas.
Trust them you're sittin' pretty here. What do you want most? Hank hesitated, staring at the quilt.
He didn't dare say it, but Charlie wasn't one for waiting.
Out with it, Hank. I ain't got all night.
Hank mumbled, well, maybe a family again. Someone to share this with. Charlie clapped his hands, loud enough to rattle the window.
That's the spirit.
Now listen, you seen that gal around the Tate place? The looker, 'bout 20, always floatin' around with the hired girls. Hank blinked, picturing her, Lydia, he figured her name was, with dark hair and a smile that could melt snow. She'd caught his eye a few times, graceful as a deer, helping Mary and the others with chores. Yeah, I've seen her, he admitted.
What about here? Charlie's grin widened. How'd you like to marry here?
I'll play matchmaker, talk to the Tates, set it up.
She's a catch, and you deserve some happiness.
Hank's jaw dropped. Marry her? She's a Tate, probably got suitors lined up from here to Louisville. Why'd she pick a washed-up teacher like me? I'd just make a fool of myself if they laughed me out. Charlie puffed up, indignant.
A fool? You're a vila, cousin, my blood.
They'd be lucky to have you. I'll fix it with Jerry and his kin. Ain't nobody sayin' no to me down where I work.
Give me a minute.
He hopped off the bedpost and strode out, vanishing through the wall like smoke. Hank sat there, stunned, half expecting it was a dream. But not 10 minutes later, Charlie burst back in, red-faced and beaming. It's done. Jerry's on board, says Lydia's taken a shine to you anyhow. Wedding's set for a few days from now. You'll bring her back to Willow Creek after, let her see your roots. Pick a date, and I'll handle the rest.
Hank stammeret, I ain't got money for a wedding, Charlie. No ring, no notin. Charlie warfet it off. PFFT, Ivy got you covered.
Won't cost you a dime.
Trust your royal cousin.
Hank couldn't argue with that grin. All right, then, next Saturday.
Do your magic.
Charlie nodded and vanished, leaving Hank to wonder what he'd gotten into. The days ticked by slow, doubt creeping in. Maybe Charlie was pulling his leg again. But come Saturday evening, as the sun dipped low, Charlie showed up at the guest room door, a fancy suit slung over his arm.
Time to shine, cousin. Here is your getube. Borrowed IT from a fella who don't need it no more.
Hank slipped into the suit, black wool, a little snug but sharp, and followed Charlie to the parlor. The room transformed before his eyes. Charlie pointed at the rafters. Hang some lanterns there.
Red paper lanterns blinked into place.
Drape some ribbon here.
Crimson streamer unfolded across the walls.
In minutes, the space was decked out, flowers blooming from nowhere, a fiddler striking up a tune in the corner. Hank gaped.
How'd you? Charlie just winked.
Perks of the job. Then Lydia stepped in, a vision in white lace, her hair pinned with wildflowers. Hank's breath caught. She was prettier than a June sunrise. Guests filed in, Jerry, the boys, the hired girls, all smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. The preacher, a wiry fella Jerry'd called in, rattled off vows, and Hank managed an I do without tripping over his tongue. Lydia's I do was soft but sure, and just like that, they were hitched. After the cake, sweet as sin, conjured from thin air, Hank pulled Charlie aside.
I over you, cousin.
This is more than I ever hoped. Charlie clapped his back.
Enjoy your wedding night, Hank. Don't waste the spring evening on me.
He tipped his hat and faded out, leaving Hank to turn back to his bride. Lydia sat on a cushioned bench, veil tossed aside, glowing in the lantern light. Didn't think I'd see a day like this, Hank said, sitting beside her. Me neither, she replied, her voice like a melody. But here we are, Mr. Wheeler, meant to be. Hank and Lydia's wedding night melted into a honeymoon glow that lingered. They settled into a rhythm at the Tate place, Hank teaching the boys by day, Lydia pitching in with the household, and evenings spent on the porch, her head on his shoulder as crickets sang. She was a wonder, cooked cornbread fluffy as clouds, laughed at his dumb jokes, and had a way of making the world feel right again. Hank couldn't believe his luck. Pinch me, Charlie, he'd mutter to the empty air, half expecting his cousin to pop up.
5 years flee by like a Kentucky breze.
Lydia gave birth to twins, a boy Caleb, with Hank's brown eyes, and a girl Rose, who got her ma's dark curls. The Tate house buzzed with kid laughter, and Hank's grief over Ellie softened, replaced by a contentment he hadn't known since his schoolboy days. Jerry Tate doted on the little ones, his gruff voice turning gentle when he bounced them on his knee.
One night, over a supper of ham and biscuits, the old man raised a glass.
Been a good run here, folks. Lived in Ohio for this, still got sons and a grandson up there.
Timey head back north.
You've made this place home, Hank, and I'm grateful. Hank's fork paused midair.
You leavin'?
Jerry nodded, sipping his cider.
Yup.
Been 5 years since you rolled in. Your bad luck's turned, son, good fortune's knockin' now.
Wagons ready for you tomorrow. Take Lydia and the kids back to Willow Creek. Start fresh.
Got $1,500 here for you. He slid a fat envelope across the table. That's for living costs, and maybe some shoe-lin if you want to climb higher. Hank's throat tightened. He'd grown fond of Jerry, felt like kin after all this time. Lydia teared up too, hugging the old man like he was her own pa. Don't get all weepy, Jerry chuckled, patting her back.
Go pack up Mons Riesen.
They spent the night boxing their things. Books, quilts, the twins' wooden toys.
Come down, the wagon weitet, horses snorting steam in the cool air.
As they loaded up, Jerry handed Lydia a rolled-up blanket, bright with patchwork. Put this under your feet, he said.
Old trick. Keep the road smooth. You'll be fine.
She smiled, tucking it in the wagon. Back in Willow Creek, Hank fixed up the farmhouse with Jerry's cash. New roof, fresh paint, a barn for a milk cow. That fall, he took the state exam for a teaching license and aced it, landing a job at the county school. Life was good, until Lydia dropped a bombshell one evening. They were sipping coffee by the fire, kids asleep upstairs, when she set her mug down.
Hank, Tereso meten you aukta no boot me ensetates.
He raised an eyebrow.
What's that?
She took a breath.
You remember who Charlie set us up?
Said the Tates were special? Well, they're not exactly human. Jerry, the boys, the girls, they're fox spirits, been around longer than you'd guess. Me, I'm different, flesh and blood, born to a real ma and pa. Hank's coffee nearly spilled.
Fox spirits?
Like in them old tales? And you, what's your story then? Lydia smiled, soft but steady. My pa's a big shot, James Carver, runs the state treasury up in Frankfurt. Years back, he fell for a preacher's daughter on his way to an exam. They had me, but he took off, and my ma couldn't keep me.
Left them by the road.
Jerry found me, raised me as his own till Charlie brought you along. Hank stared, piecing it together. So you're sayin' your pa's alive? And Jerry's some kind of fox? She nodded.
Yup.
Wanted to tell you sooner, but it never felt right.
Hank lauk hit, that's it.
Well, I'll be. Guess I married into a tall tale. The next day, they hitched the wagon to Frankfurt, twins in tow, to track down James Carver. Lydia insisted. She wanted her folks to know her family. At the Carver mansion, a stern maid ushered them in. James's wife, Margaret, met them in the parlor, prim graying with a sharp eye. "What's your business?" she asked, sizing them up. Lydia pulled a folded paper from her coat. "Got a poem here. Can't make heads or tails of it. Thought you might help." Margaret unfolded it, a yellowed sheet with scribbled lines. 10 lives past, a soul takes flight, / born of love in preacher's light, / serpent dreams and raven's call, / giant shadow claims it all. Below was James's name, in his own hand. Margaret's face tightened, studying Lydia.
"Wehret you getzis?" Lydia shrugged.
"Came with me when I was born." Margaret grilled her, birth date, details, and called James in. He strode in, 50-ish, with a politician's polish, and took the paper. "This yours?" he asked. Lydia nodded. "Found it on me as a baby, April 10, 1895.
James paled, glancing at Margaret.
"It's her," he whispered. Margaret lifted Lydia's sleeve. Sure enough, a red birthmark the size of a nickel sat behind her elbow, just like she'd remembered from her lost girl. They collapsed into a tearful hug, James, Margaret, and Lydia, a family reunited. Turns out Margaret was that preacher's daughter, gone respectable after James left her behind. The parlor of the Carver mansion turned into a flood of tears and hugs. James Carver, the slick state treasurer, and Margaret, his once preacher's daughter wife, clung to Lydia like she'd vanish again. Hank stood back, twins tugging at his pants, watching the scene unfold. Margaret wiped her eyes, laughing through sobs.
"Jure hours. Lost you 20 years ago, and here you are."
James nodded, voice thick. "I wrote that poem the night you were born, left it with your ma for I ran off like a fool. Never thought I'd see it again." They stayed up late, swapping stories. Lydia told them about Jerry Tate, how the fox spirit raised her, how Charlie Dawson played Cupid.
James chuckled. "That's it. Foxes and ghosts?
Sounds like a dime novel." Margaret squeezed her hand.
"Don't matter who brooked you up, you're home now."
The next day, they threw a proper welcome, roast beef, fiddlers, the works, officially claiming Lydia as a Carver. Hank and the kids got the royal treatment too, piled with gifts, a trunk of clothes, toys for Caleb and Rose, even a new rifle for Hank. But the visit wasn't all sunshine. As they packed to head back to Willow Creek, James pulled Hank aside, his face drawn.
"Got trouble brevin, son.
Made a bad call in Frankfurt, signed off on some funds that went sour. Old rival sniffing around, looking to nail me for it. Could lose everything if it don't get fixed fast." Hank frowned.
"Any way out?"
Margaret chimed in, clutching a letter. "James's old boss, Senator Travis, could pull strings, if we get word to him in Nashville quick. Trouble is, it's 600 miles, and we've got 2 days tops." Lydia perked up, a glint in her eye. "I can handle that."
Jerry taugt a trick or two.
James raised an eyebrow, but Hank grinned. "She's got some of that Tate magic. Trust her." Lydia fetched the patchwork blanket Jerry'd given her, spreading it on the lawn.
James scribbled a plea to Travis, handing it over.
"If you can get this there, I'm in your debt." Lydia sat cross-legged on the blanket, and with a whisper it shimmered, lifting off into a swirl of rainbow mist, like a storm cloud gone soft. She shot skyward, twins cheering from the porch, and vanished over the horizon. By noon, she was hovering over Senator Travis's Nashville estate. The staff gawked as she drifted down, mist fading back to a blanket. "I'm Lydia Carver, James's daughter," she said, brushing off her dress. "Got an urgent letter for the senator." Travis, a barrel of a man with a silver mustache, met her in his study, reading James's note. "This is tight," he grunted, "but I owe him one from way back. Thing is, he didn't say what he needs clear enough."
"Weit hier, il vritte a reply."
"Can you get it back fast?" Lydia nodded.
"Quicker tan a jackrabbit."
Travis scratched out a letter, and Lydia took off again, rainbow mist trailing.
She landed back in Frankfurt before supper, handing James a reply.
He read it, relief washing over him. Travis'll smooth it over, called in a favor. "I'm clear." Margaret hugged her tight.
Jure a miracle, girl.
From then on, James doted on Lydia. When he climbed to state auditor years later, he credited her save. Hank, meanwhile, parlayed his teaching gig into a county superintendent post after acing another exam, his luck finally holding. The family thrived. Caleb and Rose grew strong. The farmhouse became a hub of laughter. Lydia's blanket stayed tucked away, a quiet reminder of her roots. When Hank looked back, he saw Charlie's hand in it all, a ghost who turned his misery into gold. And that's where we leave him, folks. Hank Wheeler, from broke to blessed, thanks to a little spectral nudge. Now, let's wrap this yarn. Hank started out a dreamer, crushed by hard times. Parents gone, no cash, no prospects. But Charlie, dead or not, saw him through, landed him a job, a wife, a future. Lydia's tale ties it tight. Lost child of a bigwig, raised by fox spirits, reunited by fate. Good fortune don't come free. Hank worked for it, leaned on kin, and kept his heart open.
Tat's American wie, ain't it?
Grit and a bit of magic. Mix in to make something grand.
What you think, folks?
Drop a line if this one hit home. Love hearing your takes. Next time, we'll spin another tale, maybe a miner striking it rich with a ghost's map. Till then, keep your lanterns lit and your ears open.
See ya.